So this week we're going to talk about dialectal variations. Let's go over the objectives for today's session. We're going to consider the social reasons for prejudice against different dialects. We're also going to determine differences between a language, a dialect, a pidgin, and an accent, and the phonological, grammatical, and semantic differences between dialects. I'm hoping that you will be able to use your linguistic terminology in those applications. And recognize the historical development of Ebonics, and identify different phonological and syntactical rules of African American English vernacular. So before you watch this video, you should have watched the American Tongues video or the clips of the video that I provided to you on Blackboard. You'll see that that would be listed above today's video. So if you haven't watched them yet, I would suggest for you to come back to this PowerPoint, watch those clips first. They'll sort of give you an idea about dialects and help you to start thinking about all of the issues connected to dialects. And then come back and continue watching this video. So I'm going to show you a couple of colored speech bubbles that represent some of the things that people in the video American Tongues were saying about dialects and dialectal variation in the US. Okay, I'm going to read some of these out for you. It's not too much what they say out of their mouth, it's how they say it. You can meet a person for the first time and automatically draw an opinion. I'm not going to like him. We're not going to get along together. And you don't know him from Adam or Eve just from what he's said and how he's said it out of his mouth. And just note that these are word-for-word quotes from people in the video. Let's face it, there are certain consequences for not speaking a standard dialect. For example, people may make fun of you, or you may have certain limitations in the terms of the job market. So, if you don't want to deal with the negatives, it may be very helpful to learn a standard dialect for certain situations. It may not be fair, but that's the way it is. I think you see more change in the way the blacks talk than you do the way the whites talk, because some of this yakety yak junk that they do and just go on and on and on, and when they get through, they just say good morning. There's a lot more prejudice against a southern accent than there is against any other kind. In the northern mind, the southern accent equals both ignorance and racism. Instantly, there's an ability to stereotype that person, and worst of all, they get stereotypes in terms of ability to do things like run a corporation, or take responsibility, or give a good image. There's a feeling that anybody who talks like that can't be very smart. So, some of the main concepts, hopefully, that you gathered from watching the video is that everyone has an accent to somebody. Okay? And every language is made up of a group of dialects. So when we think about a language, it's really dialect specific. Grammatically speaking, there's no hierarchy between the dialects. Society creates this illusion of an esteemed dialect, or a dialect that people see as more educated, higher class, etc. Also, I hope that you've noticed that there seems to be power differences between these dialects, and they're created in society, and they're created based on the people who are speaking that dialect. Okay, so this is very much to do with racism, because those ideas around a dialect are actually formed because of the people that are speaking that dialect. And then lastly, there are dialect prejudices, right? So there are certain attitudes and stereotypes that have been formed about dialects, and they are completely sort of unfounded. It's solely based on society's and sort of racial prejudice. No dialect is better than another in terms of grammar. We do use dialects for different reasons in different contexts, but grammatically, linguistically, all of these dialects are equally complex. Are rule-governed systematic, but they just differ from each other in terms of where you use one versus the other. So we're going to learn more about dialects today, and the fact that they aren't just phonological differences. It's not just the sound or the accent that's different, but also there are morphology, lexical, syntactical aspects of the dialects that are different, and that's how we can distinguish them. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between a language, a dialect, and an accent. We know that a language is systematic and rule-governed, and there are rules associated with how a language sort of is structured. We know that in a language there are systems of phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, right? These are the linguistic units that we have studied. So let's talk about a dialect. How is a dialect different from a language? Basically, a dialect is a particular variety of language, okay? It makes up that it represents that language, okay? Just like the Southern US English dialect is English. It represents the English language, but it is a particular variety of English, okay? You can say that another variety of English would be British English, right? Or even more particular, South African English or Jamaican English, right? All of those are different dialects. And the way that we can tell dialects apart, right, rather than just based on sound alone, which is not really a good indication of whether a person is speaking a different dialect. And you can use myself as an example. Obviously, you can hear that I have a different accent than Americans do because I come from South Africa. But if you were to listen to what I'm saying, you would notice that I'm using the same dialect as somebody who would be speaking standard American English in the classroom, right? So that more sort of formal dialect, I'm using that dialect too. It's just that my phonology, my accent is different. Doesn't mean I'm speaking a different dialect, okay? But the way that you can distinguish dialects from one another is through looking at the lexicon, the vocabulary, the phonology, the sound. But again, remember, sound is not a justification alone for a difference in dialect. And then the grammar is something that will give you an idea as to whether the dialect is actually different. Okay, so if somebody were to say water fountain versus bubbler, or hoagie versus sub, right? Those are two ways to say the same thing. But that is an indication that that person comes from somewhere else, and they may have a few different vocabulary terms or ways of saying things than others do in that area. Phonologically, in New York, they would say something like walk the dog, right? Something like that. In Boston, they might say something like pack the car, right? And so there's different phonology to that. In British English, also in South African English, and I think in Jamaican English, they say bathroom rather than bathroom as they do it in America. That's a phonological difference. And then grammatically is talking about morphology and syntax. So for example, I ain't got no money is different than I don't have any money. And it's not to say that one is grammatically incorrect or the other is, there's no hierarchy between them. When we're talking about standard American English, then the appropriate way in which to sort of say it would be I don't have any money. I ain't got no money is not wrong. It's not grammatically wrong. It just belongs to a different dialect, which is used in a different context, right? Not used in the classroom, not used in school, and probably, well, definitely not used in more formal business environments. This would be probably heard and more appropriate in the community, with friends, with family members, and definitely less formal contexts. Okay, and then lastly, we get to accent. So, again, as I've sort of driven before, accents accents refer to just the phonology piece of a dialect. But one can have many different accents in a dialect, okay? An accent alone is not enough to distinguish a dialect from one another. And so the other thing I want you to I really want to drive home this week is that even though there are different dialects that exist, grammatically they share the same complexity, they share the same power. Realize that in society we privilege some dialects over others and some groups of people over others. So, for example, it's usually white Americans who speak standard American English at home. And so all other groups of people, when they get to the classroom and they make into the classroom speaking other dialects that they've learned from their communities and then from their families, those people are put automatically at a disadvantage because the classroom uses white people's dialect in the classroom. So again, another way to see how privilege works and how there's sort of racism institutionalized in the classroom. And I'm going to talk about how you as teachers should be thinking about different dialects and the different dialects of your students, and how we're going to switch the mind frame of looking at other dialects and seeing them as negative or less. Okay? What we're going to focus on as teachers is understanding and valuing the differences of dialects, and being explicit about teaching everyone the dialect that they need to know in order to do well in school and to do well in their professional life. That is not a replacement of the dialect that they learn at home. Okay? We don't want to do that. That dialect that they learn from home and in their communities that is different to standard American English is valuable, is rich, is necessary in other areas of life. Okay, so we as teachers are going to focus on having our students learn at least another dialect, the standard American English, but maintaining their home dialect so that they become bi-dialectical.